comes in the name of the Lord. Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, Messianic Rabbi Eric Walker. Our next guest, Glenn Schroder, has been a part of the Vineyard movement since 1976, when he started attending a little home group in Yorba Linda, California, that eventually became the Anaheim Vineyard. He and his wife Donna had the opportunity to travel and minister with John Wimber. Glenn served on staff with him for 13 years. He's currently the regional coordinator for Vineyard Missions USA in Mexico and Central America, and pastors Cascade Vineyard Church in Portland, Oregon. Here to talk about his new book, Never Trust a Leader Without a Limp, the wit and wisdom of John Wimber, the founder of the Vineyard Church movement, is Glenn Schroder. Glenn, welcome to Revealing the Truth.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me on today.
Well, it's great to have you here. The Vineyard movement, I've always looked at it as kind of a movement, not a denomination, kind of a something that I'm not sure that a lot of people really understand unless they get from the outside in. They may or may not understand. You can read the statement of faith and get some clarity that it's not some wild, convoluted construct of the gospel. But there is a lot of freedom. There is a lot of leaders who are not quote unquote seminarians. The model is like Putty Putnam. You know Putty out of
I do.
All right, so I work closely with Putty's brother-in-law, who's in the publishing business, and I've interviewed Putty. So this model of taking people out of the ranks and having demonstrated is actually the old model of the scriptures. There were no seminaries back then. You were discipled, and if you showed promise. And it's interesting that we see Jesus, we talk about the 12, but he sent out 70. Where'd the other 58 come from? You know, we talk about the 12, but when he sent them out, he sent 70 of them out 2 by 2. People don't talk about it. So wait a second, where'd the other 58 come from? And how did they get to be, and so if there was 24, you might say, okay, well, there was an apprentice that went along, but this is a much larger number. So it's kind of interesting as being an outsider looking in to understand all this. So let's go back to your early years. Were you raised in a family of faith? How did you come to know the Messiah?
I came to know the Lord as a teenager, and my family was attending a denominational church at the time. And I was initially forced by my mother to go to their youth group. But in the context of that group, I really not only made some lifelong friendships, but I met Jesus. And so that was foundational for me. About 19 years old, I, as you mentioned earlier, wandered into a little home group. I was invited by a friend of a friend. I was familiar with a very traditional model of church, very formal. This was very informal and something I was not at all accustomed to, but almost immediately felt not only welcomed and accepted, but felt very much the presence of God in ways that I had not experienced previously in my own life. So really that was the kind of the beginning of the end for me. I connected with that group. It later became, as you mentioned, the Anaheim Vineyard, which developed into the Vineyard movement. And you use the term, and we consider ourselves, the term we like is community of churches. So for all intents and purposes, we function very much like a denomination. However, we would say that relationship is a higher priority than government. And so we're really highly relational in our approach to one another. We do have national and regional overseers and sort of a governmental structure, but it's really highly built on relationship.
The vision for all this, as you write about, was John Wimber. And you had the opportunity And from what I understand, it's kind of on a parallel to having traveled with one of any of the great leaders who started movements, who were at the forefront of new revival and new birth of a new model, if you will. And so the mentorship and the relationship was kind of like what I grew up in Judaism, is that I was,
Right.
shepherded by a rabbi from a very young age. And then through the course of my adult life, was able to study with one rabbi for over 20 years. Knew his family and his life story and his idiosyncrasies, and kind of had come to this crossroads of now that I know who you really are, am I still willing to let you teach me? Because all of us are human. All of us are fallible. All of us are flawed. And when you're close to people and you see those flaws, you have to make a decision.
That's right.
Are they so flawed that it negates the good, or are they just another kind of just different in certain ways, or maybe I'm here to help temper some of that. Someone who shepherded me had kind of a short fuse, and the more time I spent with them, the more time I was exposed to that short fuse, and found a way to insert myself, because I knew that once the spark was lit, if I didn't pull the cord out of the dynamite, it was going to explode. And I kind of took on that role, not as an armor bearer, but as a disarmor bearer. But yet I had to make that decision once I knew he was a little bit of a hothead, which was not a reflection of Messiah. Could I still follow his teaching? So in your time with John Wimber, I'm sure you had some of your own moments as you grew close and had observations of your own, as we do. How did you two get introduced, and how did you become a part of traveling with him and engaging?
Well, our stories have some parallels. Interestingly enough, John referred to his discipleship process as a rabbinic model. And as you mentioned, myself and any number of other vineyard leaders today are not seminarians. We weren't trained in seminary. I was trained by tagging along with John, very much a show and tell sort of model, where he would invite us into a process as young people. We would go with him and watch him do ministry. He would then release us to do ministry with him, and then he would watch us do ministry. And that's really how our movement grew. When I first started attending that little home group there in California, John was a church growth consultant working with Fuller Seminary. He wasn't there. His wife and some friends of theirs at the church that they had been a part of had started a little group really seeking more from God. And so I was introduced to John a few weeks after that, when he showed up at the group, and it began to shape and form and grow, and eventually became what was ultimately the Anaheim Vineyard. And so John really believed that ministry was to be done by the people, as you mentioned earlier, with Jesus passing it on to his disciples. And so when he would do anything, really, whether it was a service on Sunday or a conference or travel, he would take teams with him, and we would go along and be the ministry team. And when it was time for prayer at the end of the service, rather than people lining up to wait for the person up front to pray for them, John would release those of us that were with him to pray for people, and really in that way modeled ministry being done, by the congregation at large rather than by one person.
In my description of myself, I introduced myself as a Pentecostal, charismatic, spirit-filled Jew.
Okay.
From everything I can observe, that except for the Jewish part, that kind of would be what you embrace is authentic move of the Spirit, believing in what the Word of God says, not following the path of sensationalism, but certainly embracing the supernatural.
Yeah, absolutely. Any one of all of those descriptions, other than the Jewish part, would have been used of John and of the Vineyard Movement at some point. We would probably lean towards saying Spirit-filled, definitely embracing the gifts of the Spirit. But again, you called it really well, shying away from sensationalism. John was a very authentic leader, and I think if there's anything that would mark the Vineyard Movement, it would be authenticity in the use of the gifts of the Spirit, a very genuine and down-to-earth approach, if I can say that. We would be instructed if we had a word of knowledge or a prophetic word to say, I believe the Lord is saying this today, rather than thus saith the Lord.
Right.
And so it's a little different connotation there, but the idea that we are hearing from God, but we are also fallible in our ability to hear from God.
It sounds to me that it's a little bit more inclusive than exclusive.
Highly more inclusive. I think so. John was known for different things, his healing ministry, but I think the contribution he made that will have an enduring legacy is that he put ministry back in the hands of the people. So it was highly inclusive, very much a body ministry, a community ministry, rather than a God's Man of the Hour ministry.
The title of your book is Never Trust a Leader Without a Limp.
Yes, sir.
I get that. Maybe our audience won't get that, but what message is trying to be conveyed?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. So the book is a collection. John had this ability to sort of summarize both theological truth and philosophical statements in these little one-liners. And he had a number of those, and that's each chapter in my book is one of those. Never Trust a Leader Without a Limp is one of those. And really what that is communicating is that there's an authenticity in Christian leadership that sometimes can be lacking if we try to set ourselves up as being perfect, as having it all together, as knowing all the answers. I had a young woman in my church one time ask me a question. I said, I'm not sure. And she said, well, you're the pastor. Shouldn't you have all the answers? And the reality is we don't have all the answers. And so that really is just a statement saying that, hey, ministry is hard, life is hard, and those of us in leadership in Christian ministry, we've been through difficult times just like everybody else. I'm no different than you. And so sometimes there's a little bit of a limp to that. John was very authentic in his leadership style, and I think he transferred that to those that were discipled and mentored by him, myself included. I endeavor to be as authentic and genuine in my faith as I can be, and I think that bodes well with those that I disciple.
Did you find that his wit and witticism was kind of I don't know, Garrison Keillor or
it was very disarming. John was described at different times as being homey or down to earth, so I think that would be along the lines of a Garrison Keillor. I like to think of it as being very authentic. He was a genuine guy. He wasn't somebody that you looked at and thought, well, I'll never be able to be like that. I think he modeled for people a Christian lifestyle that you could look at and go, you know what, I, I can follow that because I think I can accomplish that in my own life.
So he's somebody that might say ministry is a great profession if it wasn't for the people.
I think he did say somebody asked him once, "How's your church?" He said, "My church is great. It's the people that are driving me crazy."
Right.
And he meant that tongue in cheek, but clearly, yes, he would say that.
Do you find that when people like John Wimber come along that have a balance of it's important but it's not serious? The work we do is important, but the heaviness of it that seems to be this yoke. Listen, I come from the most yoked world, and that's Orthodox Judaism. When I was ordained as a rabbi, it was heavy. It was, as I went before a tribunal and was examined, it was heavy. It started as a child. 3 years old, I hid under the desk of my rabbi because I didn't want to go to the daycare that was at the synagogue. And he let me stay there for 3 years until I was age 6 and I had to go into kindergarten. But he would start out by passing me sheets to color. Then after I could read, then he would give me words in Hebrew, picture, and I would get to color the picture, and I would learn the alphabet, and then I would learn the words. And he taught me, but under his desk. And he would slip me these pieces of paper. And he was a 16th generation German rabbi, so he was like the tallest Jewish man on the face of the earth. I think he was like 6'5", which is like gigantic for the Jews. I mean, there's no Jewish NBA players. That gives you an idea of her height. And he was like, kind of an Abraham Lincoln-looking guy. I mean, very, very, very thin, bearded, and I was like the only person in the world that anybody ever knew ever talked to him. He'd come and he would preach a message, and he'd go back in the big study, and he was very, very scholarly, as the whole family was. But it sounds like John was a little bit more folksy.
He was, and he was very disarming, very personable, very easy to get along with. He liked to joke and have a good time. He also, I think, would agree with you that what we do is very important. And he would take ministry seriously, but I think he never took himself too seriously. And so he really believed that he would say, we're just change in God's pocket, and he can spend us how he wants. And he really believed that we were at the service of the Lord. While what we did was serious and important, we shouldn't take ourselves too seriously. He was very relatable, very easy to follow, very easy to get along with, and hence, you know, taking teams of young people with him. I mean, we traveled with John for several years. There was 15, 20, 25, 30 teenagers, young adults that spent a lot of time with him on those different trips. And it was very easy. You know, it was very easy just to follow along.
In your seeing this model develop and then grow, as it built on this foundation, how extensive is the Vineyard family?
Thank you. Great question. So I'll say this. My wife and I left John's church. We were sent out in 1996. We were the 27th church plant out of that church. Currently today, there are about 700 vineyards in the United States, but Vineyard is in 100 countries, and there are, I think, close to 3,000 Vineyard churches worldwide. As you mentioned earlier, I work with Vineyard church planters in Latin America, and we just recognized Mexico as their own association of vineyard churches. There are now 40 vineyards in the country of Mexico. So it's a worldwide movement.
Is there something that uniquely distinguishes Vineyard from all others, something that's really the watchword, the keynote, the focal point in the presentation of the gospel message, or in the relationship, or is it in the gatherings? What's the heart? What makes the heart?
If there's anything that I think, and there are several distinctives maybe about the vineyard, but if there's one thing that I could summarize that, it would be naturally supernatural. So you mentioned earlier, we embrace the gifts of the Spirit. We pray for healing. We in any one of our meetings we might have a prophetic word or other gifts of the Spirit active, but they would come in a very down to earth, genuine, authentic way, rather than it would be anti-hype. It would be the opposite of being worked up or hyped up. We teach people to pray. You don't need to use King James English. You don't need to speak loud. God's not hard of hearing. Just pray in your natural voice. I think we release ministry. Equipping the saints is what John was about. And so again, if there's another distinctive, it would be that ministry is done by the body, not by the pastors or the leaders, but by everybody. We have my church is a lot of fun. I'm getting a little older, but most of my church is quite young. So my associate pastor is 26, and everybody on my worship team except one person is under 30. And so we have a real value for just releasing ministry to everybody, especially young people.
As this movement began to grow, did it appear to be followers of John Wimber and have some appearance of following a man's model or a man's teaching and come under some scrutiny in that regards?
That's another good question, and I don't think it really did at all. On one level, because of John's style and his willingness to release ministry, it was a natural sort of move away from that. But there were any number of other leaders within the movement that people could look to. So it was never really built on personality. It was never a cult of personality, never built on one person. And even today, across the country and around the world, there are any number of visible vineyard leaders who might be able to speak at a conference or speak at another church, but it would never be about that person as much as the message that they might bring.
Whenever we look at Christianity as it's played out denominationally or organizationally, there's always the skeptic, the one who distrusts, the one who says, they're a cult, don't play their music, they're a cult, don't read that book, don't drink that Kool-Aid. They're so down to earth that they don't require them to have a doctorate in theology, and they don't require them to have the education, and yet they're raising people up into positions that based on their aptitude or their gifting or their skills or their whatever it is that and somebody is responsible for identifying that and developing that in them, where they might not be qualified to go be a pastor of a different denomination's church because they don't meet the educational requirements. So it is a different model. But this was something that John Wimber saw as a place for personal growth to be shared and witnessed because the leader comes out of the group.
Yeah, almost all vineyard leaders are raised up from within. On occasion, one of the larger churches may do a pastoral search to bring somebody in that is qualified to lead a staff or a church of that size. But I would say 90% of our leaders are raised from within. There are no educational requirements, but there is an incredible value for biblical accuracy, biblical fidelity. There's a lot of internal training that we have, and many of our pastors do have seminary degrees. While it's not required, many do. And again, we have Vineyard Leadership Institute and other internal organizations that you can supplement that with. But again, I think the focus is really on the call of God and a person's willingness to respond to that appropriately, rather than to say, I'm going to go to seminary and that will qualify me to be a pastor. I believe John's statement was, we don't ordain anybody, God does. All we do is recognize it.
Right.
And so he felt like if you're called, you'll know it. And if you know it, then eventually you begin to walk that out and we'll recognize that. And that's really the way that I was introduced to ministry. I was part of John's church. I grew in my capacity to lead a small group, lead multiple small groups, lead ministry times, teach scripture, and eventually I was brought on staff as an intern, then the youth pastor, then an assistant pastor, and then sent out as a youth pastor, sent out as a church planter. I used to jokingly at one point say, at one time the church was large and I had a youth group of several hundred. I would say I've got one of the biggest youth groups in the country, but I'm not qualified to be a pastor in 90% of them.
I understand. And then you have a doctor who's a nuclear physicist.
We do.
Any
number of your guys have doctorates.
Yeah, that's Putty has his. He's a nuclear physicist, so that's what his doctorate's in. So
yeah, he's too smart for his own good sometimes.
He certainly is. We're talking with Glenn Schroder, author of a book entitled Never Trust a Leader Without a Limp, The Wit and Wisdom of John Wimber, the founder of the Vineyard Church movement. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about John's background in music, his journey to faith, and how he created an environment for every man to be welcomed into this model, this movement of the Vineyard Church movement, and really explore even deeper the wit and witticisms, some of the, as you called them, Wimberisms that he said that were of lasting impact and effect on you. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back. The Lord meets you right where you are, and so does Igniting a Nation's new live streaming outlets. You can now watch Revealing the Truth, Revealing the Bible, and Prophecy Revealed simulcast live each Monday through Friday from 10 a.m. to 1 o'clock p.m. Central Standard Time on YouTube Live, Facebook Live, Vimeo, Periscope, and through our website, www.ignitinganation.com. No matter what device you are using, our program will automatically scale so you won't have to miss a single program. And if you happen to miss an episode, you can always subscribe to the Igniting a Nation YouTube channel and access over 1,000 interviews and never miss your favorite authors, special guests, and topics that interest you the most.
There are lots of ways to see Israel, but nothing compares to seeing the land of the book and the people of the book through the eyes of two Jewish believers who can take you on a journey that will bring the entire Bible to life. When you join Rabbi Eric Walker and his #1 rated tour guide, Edo Canaan, in Israel, you'll experience incredible teachings, first-class accommodations, and actually walk where Jesus walked. You will experience the Bible transforming from black and white into living color, and you will never see the Bible in the same way again. For more information, visit us at www.ignitinganation.com/events.
The Lord contends with what contends with you, and Igniting a Nation is committed to bringing to light each and every issue that faces a believer's life. Our live stream programming and teachings
take you on a journey to finding biblical truth from a wide variety of experts who share their insights into a deeper walk with the Lord. We have assembled the most comprehensive panel of experts in the fields of prophecy, caregiving, healing from trauma, shame, and abuse, and so much more. We continue to expand our teachings and programming to meet your needs. We're committed to healing the nations with biblical truth. Visit www.ignitinganation.com to develop a deeper walk with the Lord and start your journey to a transformed life. The Bible commands us to study to show ourselves approved, but most study using Bible study tools and not actually studying the Bible chapter and verse. Igniting a Nation is pleased to present Revealing the Bible, recorded and taught each week before a live audience. We take you deeper into the actual Bible and verse in both Hebrew and English and connect the dots between the Old and New Testament. You can attend our 2 classes in Tuscaloosa and Birmingham or watch the program every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Central Time on ignitinganation.com and all our other simulcast outlets. For more information, visit www.ignitinganation.com/events.
Shalom and welcome back to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, Messianic Rabbi Eric Walker. We're talking with Glenn Schroder, author of the new book, Never Trust a Leader Without a Limp, The Wit and Wisdom of John Wimber, founder of the Vineyard Church Movement. Glenn, welcome back to the program.
Thank you so much.
Each one of your chapters is entitled with a Wimberism. Take us through some of those that are the most memorable and what the backstory behind them are.
Sure. Probably one of the most memorable, the one that John was maybe known the most for, I don't know, is The Meat is in the Street. And that came from a conversation he had with a gal who came up to him at the end of a service one evening. And she said, "When are we going to get into the meat?" And he said, "Excuse me?" She said, "You know, the meat of the word. When are we going to get into the meat?" And John's response was, "Well, the meat is in the street." And what he meant by that was that the meat of the word is not necessarily studying and digesting it ad infinitum, but it's when we begin to put it into practice. We actually take those things that we've learned and we apply them to our living. And so he was very much a practitioner of faith and encouraged his congregation and anybody that was under his leadership to study and read and understand the word, but then to take it into their heart, apply it to their life, and begin to walk and live it out. So that was one.
What was his excuse me? What was his background that led him to faith and to come with this attitude of this internal discipleship model? The kind of freedom, more the Bible, but with wider margins, I think is probably how I would summarize it.
You know, John had a very interesting background. So he was a professional musician, and in the 1960s achieved some degree of success, and he connected with a group called the Paramours that later became the Righteous Brothers. And so in 1964, the Beatles were touring the United States on their first U.S. world tour, and they chose the Righteous Brothers to be their opening act. So John was set to go on tour with the Beatles when he was invited to a Bible study by an oil field worker in Yorba Linda, California, named Gunnar Payne. Gunnar was an oil roughneck. In my book, I identify him as having rough hands and a soft heart. And he was a guy who loved the Lord a lot and really led John into a place of faith and caused him to reevaluate the direction of his life and eventually leave the music industry and get involved in pastoral ministry. But that said, early on in the Vineyard movement, I think was very well known for our worship music, and really were one of the early leaders in sort of a contemporary worship movement that's obviously exploded today. So there was a music background, but I think that sort of lifestyle fed into John's desire to see not only a genuine faith and an authentic faith, but to see a faith that involved everybody, that everybody got to be involved in.
You know, it's interesting. I was at Penn State in the 60s, and 60s and early 70s, graduated in 72. But that was the high point of the Jesus movement on the college campuses, and it just completely flew by me. I know many of the Jewish people who came to the Lord during that period of time. But what's interesting is that my corporate career led me to Atlanta, and I spent 35 years in Atlanta, and I ran into an old friend from college who got caught up in a campus crusade and at that time and went that route. And then I'd come to the Lord, and we met full circle through his son, who was a member of a congregation that I was a member of. And so we began to compare, like, why didn't our paths cross, and why were the hippies kind of, there was only a part of the hippies that were open to this, but then there was the rest of us that we weren't open to it at all. So I didn't hear the gospel until I was 44 years old. I didn't even know Jesus was Jewish. When I came to Birmingham, the Vineyard Church here is very involved in Israel, as are many of them. And Kim Frolander, I don't know if you know Kim's name, but
Yes.
Kim is a regular guest on the program. She is our kind of the spiritual encounter with Israel. I'm in Israel every year for a couple of weeks. She does these micro tours, but she also plays a role in the Vineyard staff as kind of pastoral care for pastors who have retired, and meets and supports them with some of the programs that she heads up. So I've been kind of exposed in unusual different connections to Vineyard, but I've never been to a Vineyard church. Never been invited to speak. Never been invited to. It's hard for people to invite me to church because I'm always booked on a Sunday, preaching or teaching somewhere. That's why I always say, when people say, why are your services Friday and Saturday, says because I get guest engagements that way. It's another revenue stream for the ministry. So never attended, but from what I understand, the environment is a come as you are.
Come as you are was another one of John's little. First, let me say this: if you're ever in Portland, you have a standing invitation. You're welcome to come and speak at our church anytime you're in the area.
Thank you.
We would love to have you. But come as you are was another one of those little sayings John had. On the surface, that is a statement about sort of the atmosphere, the casual dress. You don't need your Sunday best, your suit and tie. But it really runs much deeper than that. It's really a statement about the condition of a person's heart. I think, like yourself, growing up in the 70s, there was sort of this mindset that I need to get my act together. I need to get my life together, get everything in order, and then I'll go to church. Then I'll come and meet Jesus. I think John would have said, hey, why don't you come and let Jesus help you work on some of that other stuff. And so come as you are was really, maybe you've got some unfinished business in your life. Maybe there's some sin in your life. Maybe there's some brokenness in your life. Bring that in and let God work on that with you, rather than, hey, I need to take care of this and then come in later.
There's a statement that there's an ashtray in front of every vineyard.
It's funny. I hear that a lot, and I don't know. That's not true necessarily. I'm sure there are in a number of churches. My church currently meets. We share space in a Lutheran church, and they actually do have an ashtray in front of their church, so some people could use it. But I think where that comes from is just simply the fact that you don't need to look a certain way to have a certain thing together in your life, even if if you smoke or whatever, you're still welcome.
The statement that pastoral ministry isn't easy. Anybody that's been in pastoral ministry will tell you that I think it's the loneliest single job across any occupation.
Wow. I don't know if I don't know if I would say that. I would say that it certainly has challenges in the sense of, for me, trying to be authentic and genuine in my own faith, and at the same time lead other people. It requires me to do a considerable amount of. I have to be on my game, so to speak, in terms of being able to communicate Scripture to an audience that lives in the world that we live in today. And how do I identify some of the socio-political issues, the environmental issues, things happening in our culture today? How do I equate and identify Scripture with those things so that it's relevant and meaningful to my audience? I think that's key. And no, that's not easy, and it can be challenging at times.
I think that one of the things that just occurred to me is that if you come from a congregation and let's say it's 400 or 500 people, and it's almost by consensus that people get lifted up, and people recognize and acknowledge and affirm. You have a pre-existing personal relationship, and therefore the buffer that pastorally that you have to create when you're the counselor, when you have that pastoral privilege, when you see the underside, the underbelly, the dark darlings of the heart through counseling, or you have to do accountability or discipline or any of those things. That's what makes it when you come into or even start like I did. I planted a congregation, and as it grew, I couldn't be best friends with people that were congregants because you just can't. And so that kind of made, if you were devoted to the work, and I had a congregation of 750 families, 2,250 coming through a week, 4 services. You kind of have to keep an arm's length, so it winds up that by the time you spend 10 hours of study to pump out a 1-hour message, you do 4 of those a week, that's 40 hours. I did 30 hours of counseling a week, that's 70 hours. Then you have the preaching and teaching time, that was 4 hours, that's 74 hours, and I still haven't disconnected from anything. And so, what's that?
See, you're making me tired already.
Yeah, but I've been doing that since 1972. That's been kind of my working model. So people always say, well, you're going to burn out. And I say, well, listen, my mother's 94. She's on a global farewell tour. She spent a week in Vegas, a week in Denver. She's getting ready to go to Europe, and she's 94 years old. She has a younger boyfriend, he's 90, and they travel together, but they have separate rooms. And I said, you're like Madonna going on this farewell tour. And she said, yep, I'm just living out my life until I lived out my life. And so we're kind of people that go at that pace. When you opened up to John Wimber on a personal level, when you faced some of those dark nights of the soul, the little dark darlings of the heart, how did he minister to you? Because that kind of became a framework for your understanding of of pastoral care.
Yeah, John had an amazing ability to speak life and positive influence, even in small little segments. One thing he did was, as mentioned earlier, kind of modeled Christian life for us day to day. He was he was a leader of a large church and a large movement, but was a very authentic, down to earth guy. But he was also very honest in what it takes to continue in life. One personal story: before I was on staff with John, I had a gardening business and I was his gardener. And I showed up at the house one day to take care of the landscaping, and I happened to be going through one of those dark times. I don't remember the nature of it right now. I just remember I was having a down day, a down week, and I pulled up, and it was interesting. And I credit this to the Holy Spirit, but very rarely was John home when I was there to do the yard. But that particular day he was, and as soon as I pulled up, he walked out of the house. He came over and he leaned on the window of my truck and stuck his head in. He said, "How you doing?" And I said, "Gosh, John, I'm going through a hard time." And I kind of cried the blues to him for a little while. And then he said, "Well, you're doing the right thing." I said, "I'm doing the right thing. What do you mean?" He goes, "Well, when you feel like that, what you want to do is pull your head under the covers and stay in bed and cry all day. But what you need to do is get up, put your shoes and socks on, and go to work." He goes, "You do that and you pray in the Spirit until it lifts." And I tell you, I almost immediately felt better. He said, "Okay, have a good day," and he slapped me in the side of the head and walked back in the house. I went to work and started praying in the Spirit, and literally my whole attitude changed within a short period of time. And that was some of the best counsel I've ever gotten. I've been able to repeat that counsel to any number of young people over the years.
John Wimber was 63 years old when he passed.
Correct.
He was a young man.
Young man.
And the closer I get to 70, the younger he is. How did the church, he passed in 1997, 23 years ago. How did it shake the foundation, or was the foundation pretty solid by that point in time?
Yeah, that's another great question. So John had some health issues prior to passing and had already handed the church off to somebody else, which was a challenging time. It went through a number of years where the congregation was smaller than it had been under John's leadership previously. However, it was still a large church. As of late, just about 2 years ago, the person that it was handed off to did it for 20 years. He actually pastored there, I think, a little bit longer than John did. He retired, and another young man took it over, and the church is doing quite well today. It's a thriving congregation in Southern California to this day. So again, the ministry, as much as John would say and I would say, wasn't built on him, he certainly was a charismatic personality and did have a lot to do with the success there, but it wasn't totally built on him. So that church does continue and thrive today. And again, so to me, my book was really a kind of a statement of the legacy of who John was in the foundational movement. Our movement, the Vineyard movement today, obviously there's a lot of people that never met John, and I'm realizing there's a lot of young people in our churches today that never met anybody that met John. So I spoke at a youth conference recently, and they told me at the end, hey, that the kids really loved hearing from somebody that knew John. And I realized, well, they've never even met anybody that met him. And so I just wanted to kind of preserve a little bit of our identity. And for this generation and generations ahead, that's really kind of what was behind the idea of the book to begin with.
Do you find that the model ties in with and is a little bit more relatable to this group we call millennials, who are looking for relevance, not for theoretical. They're looking for if it's got meaning and measurable change and impact, then we're all for it. But if it's expository, if I've just got to sit there, suck it in, and then go figure it out, well, that's not real relevance. Yeah, I could do that at home reading Kerouac.
I think Vineyard is again, I tell my congregation, we're not the only church around, we're not the best church around, but I do think we are uniquely positioned to reach the millennial generation. My church is predominantly millennials, and I think that if we tell them that your role is to come, sit, listen, and behave yourselves, we're not going to get very far. But what we do provide is an opportunity to make a vital contribution. And if they can participate and be a part of something, and again, I think something relevant, you mentioned it, is important. We want to be as active as possible in our community. Part of what we do every week, a big part of our ministry here, is a local food bank. We take care of those in need in our community. In a couple months, we'll be part of a citywide free health clinic that'll go on for a day. And so those are the kinds of things, I think, that keep us relevant, that keep us connected to the community at large. We're not this little hermetically sealed bubble on a hill that nobody can get in and nobody comes out. We want to be as actively engaged in our community as possible. I think that translates really well and seems to be a point of contact for that generation.
We've been talking with Glenn Schroder, author of Never Trust a Leader Without a Limp, The Wit and Wisdom of John Wimber, founder of the Vineyard Church Movement. This is by no means an endorsement of a denomination or Igniting a Nation Ministries, putting our stamp of approval on one denomination over another. But as we examine the life of a leader who has had some impact that endures 20 years, 25 years, 30 years after they've stepped out of the leadership role, and the model continues to grow and to thrive, those are the kind of people we want to take a look at and see their contribution and why it stood the test of time based on strong biblical principles. So if you are interested in getting to know the heart and wit of John Wimber, the founder of the Vineyard Church Movement, this is a book you'll find fascinating, entertaining, and something that you can identify with. Glenn Schroder, we thank you for being with us and sharing his story and your story here with us on Revealing the Truth.
Hey, thank you, Eric, so much for having me on today. It was a pleasure.
God bless, my friend. Thank you. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll bring you the next edition of Revealing the Truth.